There is a dream that haunts the modern psyche. In this dream, you are standing in a vast theatre. The stage is empty, but you feel the weight of invisible strings attached to your wrists, your shoulders, your thoughts. You look up, expecting to see a puppeteer, but there is only darkness. You look down at your hands and realize you are both the puppet and the one holding the strings. You try to move freely, but every gesture feels rehearsed. Every word you speak seems scripted by something you cannot name. And then comes the question that shatters the dream. Who is in control? This is not merely a dream. This is the central psychological crisis of our age. A crisis that Carl Jung predicted nearly a century ago, and one that now unfolds in real time across every screen, every algorithm, every curated moment of our digital lives. We live in an era that worships control. We optimize our routines, track our behaviors, engineer our emotions through apps and stimulants and endless self-improvement protocols. We believe we are the architects of our destinies, the masters of our minds, the commanders of our consciousness. But Jung knew something we have forgotten. He knew that beneath the polished surface of the ego, beneath every carefully constructed identity and every rational decision, there exists a vast, churning ocean of forces we do not understand. Forces that do not obey our commands. Forces that, when ignored, do not disappear but grow stronger in the shadows of our psyche. He called this the shadow, and he warned us. The more we deny it, the more it controls us. Tonight, we descend into that warning. We journey into the paradox at the heart of human consciousness, the terrifying truth that our desperate attempts to control ourselves, our world, our future, may be the very thing that enslaves us. This is not a story about weakness. This is a story about power, real power. And what happens when we mistake the map for the territory, the mask for the face, the ego for the soul? By the end of this journey, you will understand why Jung believed that the greatest danger facing modern humanity is not external catastrophe, but internal fragmentation. You will see how our technologies of control have become mirrors reflecting our deepest fears, and you will confront a question that cannot be answered, only lived. What would you become if you stopped trying to control who you are? The theatre is dark. The curtain rises, the puppet awakens. Let us begin. To understand Jung's warning, we must first travel backward, not merely through history, but through the architecture of consciousness itself. Imagine for a moment the earliest humans. They wake in a world without explanation. Lightning splits the sky without warning. Animals attack without pattern. Death arrives like a thief in the night. The universe is chaos incarnate, beautiful, terrible, utterly beyond control. And so begins humanity's first great psychological project, the construction of order from chaos. We create fire, and suddenly, the darkness obeys our command. We plant seeds, and nature yields to our will. We invent language, and the invisible becomes visible, nameable, controllable. With every innovation, the circle of control expands, the wilderness shrinks, the unknown becomes known. This is the birth of the ego, the conscious mind that says, I am separate from the chaos. I am the one who acts, who chooses, who controls. For thousands of years this worked. The ego was not a prison but a tool, a flashlight in the dark forest of existence. It allowed us to survive, to build civilizations, to reach towards the stars. But something changed in the modern era. The flashlight became a spotlight. The tool became an identity. The means became the end. In 1637, a French philosopher sat alone in a stove-heated room, doubting everything he thought he knew. René Descartes was engaged in a radical experiment. He would strip away every assumption, every belief, every sensory experience, until he found something absolutely certain. And in that void, he discovered his famous conclusion. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. With those 4 words, Descartes fractured Western consciousness. He separated mind from body, subject from object, the controller from the controlled. The thinking self, rational, conscious, separate, became the only self that mattered. This was the birth of what Jung would later call the ego inflation of modernity. Descartes' ghost haunts us still. It whispers in every productivity app, "You are your conscious choices." It speaks through every self-help book, "You create your reality." It echoes in every advertisement, "Take control of your life." But Jung saw the shadow of this inflation, the dark twin of Cartesian consciousness. He saw that when we identify completely with the rational ego, we exile everything that doesn't fit. Our irrational impulses, our animal instincts, our emotional storms, our creative chaos. We push these aspects into the unconscious, where they do not die but ferment, gathering power in the darkness. And he recognized a terrible irony. The more we try to control ourselves through conscious will alone, the more we are secretly controlled by the unconscious forces we deny. Let me tell you about an experiment. In the 1970s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a study that would shake the foundations of our understanding of free will. He asked participants to perform a simple action, flex their wrist whenever they felt the urge. He measured 3 things: the moment of conscious decision, the moment of actual movement, and the moment of brain activity preceding both. The results were disturbing. The brain showed activity, the readiness potential, up to half a second before participants reported consciously deciding to act. The implication was profound. The unconscious brain initiates action before the conscious mind knows what it's doing. We think we choose. But perhaps we are merely witnessing choices already made by neural processes we cannot access. Now, Jung didn't need neuroscience to understand this. He spent decades exploring the unconscious through dreams, myths, and the symbolic language of the psyche. But Libet's experiment gave scientific weight to Jung's central insight. Consciousness is not the driver. It's the passenger pretending to steer. The ego, that proud commander of the mental ship, is more like a spokesperson for vast internal governments of neurons, archetypes, complexes, and evolutionary drives. It takes credit for decisions it did not make. It creates narratives to explain impulses it does not understand. This is not a flaw, it's a feature. The ego's job is to maintain the illusion of coherent identity, to tell a story that makes sense of the chaos. But when that story becomes too rigid, when we believe too completely in our own propaganda, we cut ourselves off from the deeper sources of creativity, intuition, and transformation. We become, in Jung's words, possessed by the demon of one-sidedness. Now let us move forward in time to this moment, this exact configuration of human consciousness you inhabit as you listen to these words. You wake up, and before your eyes fully open, you reach for your phone. The blue light floods your retinas. The notifications flood your attention. Instantly, you're pulled into a stream of information, stimulation, demand. You check your productivity app. You track your steps, your calories, your sleep cycles, your mood. You optimize, you schedule, you control. Throughout the day, algorithms curate your reality. They decide what you see, what you desire, what you believe is possible. They predict your behavior with uncanny accuracy, not because they know you, but because you have become predictable, repeatable, controllable. You feel exhausted, but you cannot name why. You feel anxious, but you cannot locate the source. You feel that something essential is missing, but you do not know what it is. This is the apotheosis of the controlling mind, what we might call the Techno-Ego. It is the ego armed with unprecedented tools of self-surveillance and self-management. It is Descartes' ghost uploaded into the cloud, and Jung would see it immediately for what it is, a massive act of inflation followed by an inevitable collapse. Because here is what the Techno-Ego does not understand. You cannot control what you do not acknowledge. You cannot master what you will not meet. Every psychological force we try to eliminate through control does not vanish. It mutates. It adapts. It finds new channels of expression. The anger we suppress becomes chronic inflammation. The grief we avoid becomes depression. The wildness we domesticate becomes addiction. The shadow we deny becomes the monster in the mirror. And the more sophisticated our tools of control become, the more sophisticated our unconscious resistance becomes. This is Jung's warning. This is the crisis he foresaw. The question is no longer whether we can control ourselves. The question is, what are we becoming in the attempt? Let me tell you about a man who tried to achieve perfect control and what happened when he succeeded. His name was Johann, and though he is a composite drawn from Jung's case studies, his story echoes through countless real lives. Johann was a brilliant engineer in Zurich, meticulous and disciplined. He prided himself on rationality. He scheduled every hour of his day. He maintained perfect emotional composure. He had eliminated all inefficiency, all spontaneity, all chaos from his life. He was, by every measure of modern achievement, successful. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, as he sat at his perfectly organized desk, something inside him broke. It started as a small tremor in his hand, then a tightening in his chest, then a sensation he could not name. He tried to control it, of course. He used his rational mind, his willpower, his carefully cultivated techniques. But the more he tried to stop the panic, the stronger it became. Within weeks, he could not work. Within months, he could not leave his home. The man who had controlled everything now controlled nothing. When he finally came to Jung, Johann asked the question that Jung had heard 1,000 times. What is wrong with me? How do I fix this? And Jung's answer was not what he expected. Nothing is wrong with you. Something is trying to emerge. Johann's collapse was not a malfunction. It was a message. His unconscious mind, denied and ignored for years, had finally found a way to break through. The panic attacks were not enemies to be defeated, but messengers to be heard. This is Jung's most radical insight, and the one modern psychology still struggles to accept. Symptoms are not just problems, they are solutions. They are the psyche's attempt to restore balance when the ego has gone too far in one direction. Think of the psyche as a vast ecosystem. The ego is like a city built within that ecosystem, necessary, valuable, but ultimately dependent on the wild forest surrounding it. When the city expands too aggressively, when it paves over every natural space and eliminates every non-human element, the ecosystem begins to collapse. The rivers flood. The air becomes toxic. Strange creatures emerge from the sewers. This is what happens in the psyche when the ego tries to control everything. The repressed elements, the shadow, the instincts, the creative chaos, do not disappear. They gather force. They form complexes, autonomous psychological entities that operate outside conscious control. And eventually, they erupt. Jung called these eruptions invasions from the unconscious. Freud called them the return of the repressed. In mythology, they appear as monsters, demons, dragons that must be faced. But they are not truly monsters. They are parts of ourselves we have exiled, and they are desperately trying to come home. Now let us expand this from the individual to the collective, from Johann's private collapse to the psychological crisis of an entire civilization. We live in what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the achievement society, a world that has replaced external oppression with internal compulsion. We are no longer commanded by kings or gods. Instead, we command ourselves, endlessly optimizing, performing, producing. We are entrepreneurs of our own exploitation, and our technologies have become perfect instruments for this self-domination. Every app is designed to make us more efficient, more focused, more in control. But notice what happens. The meditation app that was supposed to bring peace becomes another task to complete. The fitness tracker that was supposed to improve health becomes a source of shame. The social media platform that was supposed to connect us becomes a performance stage where we curate a false self and anxiously monitor its reception. We are creating digital extensions of the ego, and with them, digital extensions of the shadow. Consider what we exile in this curated world: uncertainty, vulnerability, aging, imperfection, boredom, stillness, authentic emotion. These become the new shadow, the aspects of human experience that have no place in the optimized life. And where do they go? They do not vanish. They multiply in the dark corners of the internet, in rage-fueled comment sections, in conspiracy theories, in addiction to pornography or gambling or doom-scrolling. The shadow goes viral. Jung understood that personal neurosis and collective psychosis are not separate phenomena. They are fractals of the same pattern. When millions of individuals deny their shadow, the shadow manifests at the collective level. This is how democracies become authoritarian, by projecting the inner tyrant outward. This is how rational societies become irrational, by exiling the irrational instead of integrating it. This is how the pursuit of control becomes the doorway to chaos. Let me share a thought experiment that reveals the ultimate destination of the controlling mind. Imagine a technology that could give you perfect control over your psychological state. A neural interface that allows you to adjust your mood, enhance your focus, eliminate your anxiety with the precision of a sound mixing board. Depression? Slide the serotonin up. Distraction? Boost the dopamine. Existential dread? Activate the meaning-making circuit. Now imagine this technology becomes widespread. Within a generation, human emotional suffering is virtually eliminated. Everyone operates at optimal psychological efficiency. The psychotherapists close their offices. The philosophers retire. The artists stop creating, because art was always born from friction, from the tension between light and dark. What have we created? Paradise or a lobotomy? This thought experiment is not far from reality, feeling that the walls were breathing, that the floor was tilting, that he was watching himself from outside his body. We are already using chemical interventions to achieve exactly this kind of control, and Jung would ask us to consider, what are we losing in the process? What essential part of being human are we optimizing away? The shadow exists for a reason. Pain exists for a reason. Chaos exists for a reason. They are not bugs in the system, they are features. They are the grit that produces the pearl, the tension that generates creativity, the descent that makes possible the ascent. When we eliminate all darkness, we do not create light. We create a fluorescent wasteland where nothing real can grow. Johann sat in Jung's office trembling. He had tried everything to regain control. More discipline, more medication, more techniques. Nothing worked. He was at the edge of an abyss, and he did not know whether to step back or jump forward. Jung did something unexpected. He asked Johann to stop trying to fix himself. Instead, he asked him to pay attention, to sit with the panic without fighting it, to listen to what it was trying to say, to descend into the darkness instead of fleeing toward the light. You have been trying to eliminate half of yourself, Jung told him. Now you must learn to become whole. This was the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, of becoming not more controlled but more complete. It is not a comfortable process. It requires surrendering the illusion that the ego is supreme. It requires acknowledging that we are not singular but multiple, not rational but paradoxical, not controllers but collaborators with forces larger than ourselves. But it is the only path to genuine transformation, because here is the deepest secret. The problem is not that we lack control. The problem is that we are trying to control the wrong thing. We try to control our symptoms instead of listening to them. We try to control our environment instead of adapting to it. We try to control our identity instead of discovering who we actually are beneath the mask. Real power does not come from imposing will upon reality. Real power comes from aligning with reality, from learning to dance with the forces we cannot command. This is what Johann would slowly discover. This is what we must discover if we are to survive the crisis of the modern mind. But first, we must go deeper into the darkness. We must confront the ultimate question: what lies beyond control? There is a moment in every profound psychological transformation when something shifts. The person who has been drowning in chaos suddenly stops struggling. The person who has been fleeing the shadow suddenly turns to face it. The person who has been trying to control everything suddenly lets go. And in that moment of surrender, something unexpected happens. The ground beneath their feet becomes solid. For Johann, this moment came during a dream, or perhaps a vision. He was never quite sure which. He found himself in a vast, dark forest. The trees were ancient beyond measure, their roots tangled in darkness. He was terrified, lost, certain he would die. But then he noticed. The darkness was not empty. It was alive. It was filled with presences, animal shapes, whispered voices, eyes gleaming in the shadows. And instead of attacking him, they were waiting, watching, as if they had been expecting him. One presence stepped forward, a figure that seemed to shift between forms. Sometimes it appeared as a wolf, sometimes as an old man, sometimes as himself, but younger, wilder, more alive. It spoke, and its voice was his voice, but not his voice. You have been afraid of me. You have tried to lock me away. But I am not your enemy. I am your strength, the part of you that knows how to survive, how to feel, how to live without asking permission. Johann woke with tears on his face. The panic was still there, but something had changed. He was no longer fighting it. He was listening to it. This is the threshold moment, the nigredo of alchemy, the dark night of the soul, the descent to the underworld. Every wisdom tradition knows this pattern. You must die to the old self before the new self can be born. Jung spent decades studying the paradox at the heart of psychological transformation. We cannot force ourselves to change. Change happens when we stop forcing. This is maddening to the modern mind. It violates everything we've been taught about achievement, willpower, and self-improvement. We want techniques, steps, programs. We want to do something to make transformation happen. But transformation is not something we do, it is something we allow. Consider the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, action without striving, or the Buddhist practice of non-attachment, holding things lightly instead of grasping them, or the Christian concept of grace, the gift that cannot be earned, only received. All of these point to the same psychological truth that Jung rediscovered. The ego cannot transform itself. It can only create the conditions in which transformation becomes possible. What are those conditions? They are precisely the opposite of control. Attention instead of manipulation. Watching the mind instead of commanding it, acceptance instead of rejection, welcoming all parts of ourselves, including the uncomfortable ones, surrender instead of striving, letting go of the outcome and trusting the process, integration instead of elimination, bringing the shadow into the light without killing it or being consumed by it. This is the art of psychological alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold, darkness into light, unconsciousness into awareness. But it requires something most of us are terrified to give, the willingness to not know who we are. Now let us return to the question of technology, but from a different angle. What if the real technology is not out there, not in our devices and algorithms and apps, but in here, in the structure of consciousness itself? Jung believed that the psyche contains technologies of transformation that we have barely begun to explore: dreams, active imagination, symbol interpretation, ritual, article. These are not primitive superstitions to be outgrown, but sophisticated tools for reprogramming consciousness at levels the rational mind cannot access. The unconscious speaks in images, not arguments, in symbols, not logic, in stories, not data. When we try to control ourselves using only rational techniques, we are trying to reprogram the deep architecture of consciousness using the wrong programming language. It's like trying to write poetry in binary code, technically possible but missing the point. But when we learn the language of the unconscious, when we attend to our dreams, honor our symbols, engage with our myths, we gain access to transformation at the source code level. Consider Johann again. Jung didn't give him techniques to control his panic. Instead, he asked him to paint, to write down his dreams, to dialogue with the figures that appeared in his imagination. This sounds impractical, even absurd to the modern mind. What does painting have to do with anxiety? Everything. Because through painting, Johann was able to give form to the formless dread. He was able to see the shadow, recognize it, relate to it. And gradually, over months, something shifted. The panic didn't disappear, but it transformed. It became energy, vitality, creative force. He had not eliminated the shadow, he had integrated it, and in that integration he discovered something profound. The energy he had used to repress himself was now available for living. But this is not just about individual transformation. Jung believed we are living through a collective crisis that demands a collective awakening. The same pattern that plays out in the individual, ego inflation, shadow repression, eventual collapse, plays out in civilizations. We see it now. The obsessive rationalism of the Enlightenment has produced an explosion of irrationalism. Conspiracy theories, fundamentalism, magical thinking. The relentless optimism of progress has produced epidemic anxiety and depression. The technological domination of nature has produced ecological catastrophe. The ego of Western civilization, its belief in control, its faith in reason alone, its denial of the shadow, is collapsing. And the question is, will we integrate the shadow, or will we be destroyed by it? Jung believed that the future of humanity depends on whether enough individuals undertake the work of individuation, of becoming whole, to shift the collective consciousness. He wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. But here is the hopeful part. Every individual who integrates their shadow weakens the collective shadow. Every person who becomes conscious creates a little more light in the world. This is not a call to retreat into navel-gazing. It is a call to the most difficult and most urgent work there is, the work of becoming fully human. So what does this mean, practically? How do we live in a world that demands control while understanding the dangers of controlling? The answer is not to abandon all discipline, all structure, all conscious intention. The ego is not the enemy. Ego inflation is the enemy. Control is not the problem. The illusion of total control is the problem. The path forward is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, learning to live in the paradox. We need discipline and surrender, structure and spontaneity, planning and presence, light and dark. This is the razor's edge, the narrow path between chaos and rigidity, between being controlled by the unconscious and trying to eliminate it. It means creating routines, but being willing to break them when something deeper calls. Setting goals, but not attaching our identity to achieving them. Using technology, but not letting it use us. Developing the ego, but not worshipping it. Seeking understanding, but remaining comfortable with mystery. It means becoming what Jung called the conscious individual, someone who is neither slave to impulse nor prisoner of control, but who moves fluidly between conscious and unconscious, rational and intuitive, doing and being. This is the new control, or rather the transcendence of control. It is the wisdom that knows when to grip and when to release, when to steer and when to drift, when to speak and when to listen. It is the maturity that can tolerate ambiguity without collapsing into certainty. It is the strength that comes not from mastery, but from relationship, with ourselves, with others, with the great mysterious forces that move through us and cannot be commanded. Do you remember the dream from the beginning? The theatre, the puppet, the invisible strings? Let us return there now, but with new eyes. You are still standing on that stage. The strings are still attached. But now you understand. The question was never, how do I cut the strings? The question was always, who am I beyond the strings? Because the strings, the conditioning, the complexes, the unconscious patterns cannot be eliminated. They are part of the structure of consciousness itself. We are always, in some sense, puppets, shaped by evolutionary drives, cultural narratives, familial patterns, neurological processes. But here is the miracle. The moment we see the strings, we are already more than the puppet. Consciousness, pure awareness, is not determined by the patterns it observes. It is the space in which the patterns appear. It is the theatre itself, not just the performance on stage. Jung called this the self, the totality of conscious and unconscious, the center that is everywhere and nowhere, the eye that watches the watcher. And the journey of individuation is not about eliminating the unconscious patterns, but about expanding our identity beyond them, learning to witness the dance instead of being lost in it. This is the ultimate freedom, not control but consciousness, not mastery but presence, not the elimination of suffering, but the transformation of our relationship to it. If Jung could speak to us now, across the decades, across the boundary between life and death, what would he say? I believe he would say this: you are living through the exact crisis I warned about. The inflation of the ego has reached its peak. The technologies of control have become prisons of consciousness. The shadow has grown monstrous in the darkness. But this is not the end. This is the beginning of something new, if you are brave enough to face it. The future does not belong to those who control themselves most perfectly. It belongs to those who become whole, who integrate light and dark, conscious and unconscious, human and more than human. Stop trying to optimize yourself into an algorithm. Stop trying to eliminate everything that makes you uncomfortable. Stop trying to become some perfect, pain-free, fully controlled version of yourself. Instead, become curious. Become exploratory. Become humble before the vastness of your own depths. Attend to your dreams. Honor your symptoms. Listen to what your body is telling you. Engage with the symbols that move you. Create art that emerges from the darkness you've been afraid to face. And most importantly, stop believing you are only your conscious mind. You are so much more than that. As we close this journey, I want to leave you not with an answer but with a question, one that each person must answer for themselves. What would happen if you stopped trying to control who you are and started discovering who you are, not who you should be? Not who you were told to be, not who you're optimizing to become, but who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the masks, beneath the desperate need to keep everything together. What if the chaos you're afraid of is actually creativity waiting to be born? What if the darkness you're fleeing is actually depth waiting to be explored? What if the parts of yourself you're trying to eliminate are actually powers waiting to be integrated? What if the very thing you think is breaking you is actually making you whole? The ancient Greeks had a word, anamnesis, the idea that learning is not acquiring new information, but remembering what the soul already knows. Perhaps that's what this entire journey has been, not the discovery of something new, but the remembering of something ancient, the remembering that we are not machines to be programmed, but mysteries to be lived. The remembering that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be honored. The remembering that we are not separate from nature, not separate from each other, not separate from the vast intelligence that breathes through all things. The remembering that the puppet and the puppeteer were always the same being, dreaming it was divided. Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But perhaps we need to update that for our age. I am not what I control. I am what I allow to emerge when I stop controlling. This is the invitation. This is the challenge. This is the path forward. Not more control, but more consciousness. Not more mastery, but more mystery. Not more perfection, but more wholeness. The illusion of control is shattering, and in the space where it breaks, something truer is waiting to be born. What will you become when you stop trying to become anything? Who will you discover when you stop trying to control who you are? These are not questions for thinking. These are questions for living. The journey does not end here. It begins. Thank you for taking this journey into the depths of consciousness. If this exploration resonated with you, consider it a call, not to know but to wonder, not to solve but to question, not to control but to awaken. The echo of the ancients whispers still, know thyself, not to master yourself, but to discover the magnificent mystery you already are. Until the next descent into the unknown, stay curious, stay whole, stay human.